Welcome back to Echo Ridge, where today we're going to learn all about the self-powered oxygen machine. In fact, by the time we're done, you're going to be able to build one of these. But before we can start with that monstrosity, we need to learn everything we can about the electrolyzer. In this tutorial, we're going to be taking a bottom-up approach. We're going to be learning about the basics of the electrolyzer, and then we're going to take a look at a few simple SPOMs, or self-powered oxygen machines. And that way we gain all the knowledge to be able to build the behemoth you just saw. Now, an electrolyzer, which is actually one of the buildings based in reality, takes water and turns it into two components, oxygen and hydrogen. Specifically, it can take up to 1,000 grams or 1 kilo per second of clean water, requires 120 watts, and what we're given on the other side is 888 grams per second of oxygen, 112 grams per second of hydrogen, and a little bit of heat. As a note, the electrolyzer is an industrial machine. Now, out of all the basic information we just learned about the electrolyzer, I want you to commit to memory two figures: 1 kilo per second of clean water and 888 grams per second of oxygen. And the reason why we care so much about that oxygen number is because every duplicate consumes 100 grams per second of oxygen. Knowing that, we can surmise that when an electrolyzer is properly set up, we will be able to support 8.88 duplicates with all their oxygen needs. Keep in mind, some duplicates are mouth breathers and consume more oxygen. For a safe bet though, we typically round this down to 800 grams per second to make it nice and easy to remember. Every electrolyzer can support 8 duplicates. I also asked you to commit to memory the water requirement. And the reason why is because the amount of oxygen the electrolyzer produces is 100% a correlation of how much water you're feeding it. And what I mean by that is if you're only feeding your electrolyzer 500 grams per second of water, in other words, half, you're only going to get half as much oxygen out on the other side, or 444 grams per second. So keep this in mind after you get done analyzing all your vents and geysers. For instance, this steam vent here only provides us with an average output of 458.8 grams per second, which means it wouldn't even be able to provide half the water required for this electrolyzer to produce its maximum amount of oxygen. Alright, all this makes sense so far. Let's see it in action. The first small system we're going to look at is this one right here. I know, it's very basic and rudimentary, but like I said, baby steps and building blocks. What we're looking at here isn't actually a SPOM. It's an almost SPOM. And the reason why I say that is because in order for an oxygen producing system to be fully considered a SPOM, it needs to be 100% self-powered. This is almost self-powered. And there's a specific reason why, but this is a great place to start. Our electrolyzer has a full pipe of nice and clean water coming in. The electrolyzer is then taking that water and turning it into hydrogen and oxygen. Now, because hydrogen is a lighter gas, it rises to the top. Oxygen being heavier tends to sink to the bottom. We can use those mechanics to our advantage, although this system in itself doesn't truly do that. We have two gas pumps. One at the top of the system, the idea being that it will be taking most of the hydrogen out, and one at the bottom of the system, with the idea that it's going to be taking most of the oxygen out. But because we don't have any checks and balances in here, we sort of have oxygen and hydrogen going everywhere. Mostly the hydrogen does rise, but we still get some oxygen here. And for that reason, in this specific system, we use a gas filter. It is set to filter out all the hydrogen, and it takes all that hydrogen, and it feeds it to a wonderful hydrogen generator. The hydrogen generator then pumps all its power into the battery, which is keeping this whole system going. But because it is an almost SPOM and not a full SPOM, we have a manual generator here to help out whenever the jumbo battery runs out of power. Now, there's a couple of reasons why the hydrogen's not sitting at the top and the oxygen is at the bottom. Because we're using a gas filter, notice that sometimes this pump has to stop and wait for this pump, and vice versa. Additionally, because we learned the basics of an electrolyzer, we know that the electrolyzer produces almost 8 times more oxygen than it does hydrogen. Hence the reason why there's enough oxygen pressure in here that it rises to the top, because there's not enough hydrogen in here to keep it sort of stable. Additionally, even though this electrolyzer is being provided it's 1 kilo a second worth of water, we're not getting 100% throughput on that oxygen. And there's a couple of reasons why. First, we need to remember that a single gas pump can only remove 500 grams per second. But a more primary reason is because of the use of the gas filter. The gas filter just has limits, especially in this setup, because it has to pause and filter out the hydrogen and can't just provide a steady flow of oxygen. And we can validate that shortfall by using a gas meter valve. Now, the gas meter valve is being used a little bit differently, but long story short, we're only allowing 0.88 kilos to go through per second, or 888 grams per second, which is the exact amount we're supposed to be getting out of that electrolyzer considering how much water we're feeding it. But notice every once in a while the packets are a little bit smaller than 888 grams, and that has to do with the sort of limitation of this system. But despite the simplicity and the flaws in this design, it's still providing a fair bit of oxygen. So if you're just looking for a basic system to run that you can build quick, fast, in a hurry, yeah, still don't build this one. But for simplicity and to make sure everybody knows how to build this, we're going to go through our overlays on each one of our designs. Here's the power overlay. As a reminder, you don't actually need the gas meter valve. We just used it as a part of an experiment. There's the plumbing, there's the gas pipes, and that's really it. The next system we're going to look at is virtually identical, save for one upgrade, and that would be the use of a smart battery. In our previous example, one of the reasons why this is so inefficient is because you can see that the hydrogen generator is going to be producing power no matter how much power is in the jumbo battery. We can get a little bit more efficient by the use of a smart battery. We have the smart battery connected to the hydrogen generator using an automation wire, and the battery set at 9060, which means the battery will send out a green signal if its power level is below 60%, and it'll send out a red signal once it gets back up to 90. And what this does is provides us a small backlog of hydrogen. Now this design too, while better than the almost SPOM, is still not completely self-powered. We can call this one the nearly self-powered oxygen machine. Every once in a while, a duplicate's gonna have to come in here and help out the hydrogen generator. The only other change in this system is the use of a couple of bridges. In the almost SPOM, we never have to worry about this entire pipe getting full of hydrogen because it's so inefficient. This one, if dupes get bored long enough, there is a small chance that the hydrogen would back all the way up, especially if you didn't have enough gas pipes to store all the hydrogen. So we put in an overflow system that if the hydrogen gets all the way backed up to here, it'll jump across this bridge and it's sent to a hydrogen generator that's only responsibility is just burning off the extra hydrogen. Now in this case, it's only lighting up a lamp, but you could very easily link this up to a power grid. And I know this looks a little complicated, so I'm going to expand upon it using this design here. It's the same thing. Once hydrogen is all backed up on this line here, the hydrogen will then bypass the bridge and go down this direction. So now it makes it a little bit easier to see with the hydrogen coming through here, that a system like this, using two bridges, allows us to simplify this sort of pipe run. Alright, so this is all great, Echo. We've seen the almost SPOM, we've seen the nearly SPOM. Can we finally get to the actual SPOM? I mean, it was in the thumbnail. Yes, except there's one more thing I want to show you with this one too. One of the issue with these systems is heat. As you can see by the surrounding area, these systems create a lot of heat. First, we know the electrolyzer produces 1250 DTUs worth of heat every single second. But not only that, the smart battery produces heat, 500 DTUs per second. The hydrogen generator produces 4000 DTUs per second. And if you're using the very basic setup, the jumbo battery is producing 1250 DTUs per second. We're also making it worse because we have manual airlocks here. Considering that we probably never have to get back into here, we could help this issue out by, instead of using a door here, just insulate it out. But that's only a little bit of the heat. We're still going to get a lot of heat production coming out of the hydrogen generator and the smart battery. So let's head off to our first real SPOM and see how we can solve this issue too. Allow me to introduce you to our first 100% self-powered oxygen machine. Now this system's not running yet. And it's because I wanted to walk you through what it takes to get one of these systems running so you know what to expect. We have one full pipe worth of clean water coming in. Because there's two electrolyzers, we know that we have a maximum throughput of 1776 grams of oxygen per second, which is just 888 times 2. This is also the first system we're taking a look at that has two gas pumps on the bottom and one gas pump in the middle, and we'll see why here in a few moments. Its entire power grid is self-contained, and we even have the hydrogen overflow system built right in. But because there's no power coming from the outside world in, we're going to have to do something to sort of kickstart this whole thing. You could either connect it to your main power grid, or there's a convenient little spot right here for a manual generator. When a duplicate comes and powers up this system by running on the wheel, we're going to see one of the problems of starting up this system, and you can probably surmise what it's going to be. For the first time, there's actually no gas filter. And considering this whole area is full of oxygen, we know that this is going to get some damage because you can't feed oxygen to a hydrogen generator. So you have a couple of options. One, just wait for it to happen and keep repairing the hydrogen generator, or separate the line out to start with and put it into a gas reservoir. In this case, we're going to do the non-Echo Ridge gaming method and play it smart. Because as you can see, right now this gas reservoir only has oxygen in it, whereas otherwise all of that oxygen would be damaging this hydrogen generator. But what we're looking for before we can disconnect this gas reservoir is a solid stream of hydrogen. And that's going to take a small amount of time in order for this whole system to stabilize. The long and short of it though is all the hydrogen's going to rise and sit here, and we're going to prevent all of it from being suctioned out by the gas pump by use of an automation sensor. But if we wait long enough, you'll end up with an equilibrium that looks a little bit like this. Notice the oxygen is staying down here and the hydrogen is staying up here, preventing this gas pump from intaking any oxygen. In order to make this happen, we needed to set the bottom Atmos sensors at above 600 grams and the top one at above 250 grams. But now that we know we're only getting hydrogen in this line, we can reconnect it and dispose of our gas reservoir. But after we do that, we'll now have enough hydrogen where the hydrogen generator can take over the power responsibilities for the entire system. And just to prove that fact, we'll go ahead and deconstruct this manual generator. And while we let this run, I want to highlight a couple of important facts to learn about using a SPOM, and it has to do with gas pressure. Notice every once in a while this gas vent's getting overpressurized because, well, there's just too much oxygen in the atmosphere. The great thing about these systems is when that happens, the gas pumps just stop working. We'll highlight this fact just by separating the gas pipe. And now that the gas pipe is completely full, the gas pumps cannot pull out any more oxygen. And because electrolyzers have a maximum gas pressure, they'll stop producing oxygen and hydrogen. And with none of these devices consuming power, the hydrogen generator doesn't have to run, and it just sort of puts the whole system at a standstill. But as soon as we need more oxygen, the whole system starts running again, and it never loses equilibrium. There is one use case where you will break your SPOM, or at least have to provide more external power. Let's hypothetically say we didn't need oxygen for a long time. Maybe this was a backup system, which means these electrolyzers would stop producing oxygen and hydrogen, just as we saw earlier, and there'd be no power consumption. So the hydrogen generator would stop running, which means the battery would stop charging. And that'd be fine for a while. But remember, even smart batteries have a small power lead. So if you don't provide it with just a smidge of hydrogen every once in a while, the whole system will run out of power, and then you'll have to kickstart it again, just like we did earlier with the manual generator. But now let's continue the conversation that we started with our nearly SPOM, and that's one to do with heat. Look at all of the heat spilling out into the environment. Additionally, look how hot our chamber in here is getting. In fact, the oxygen that's coming out of here fluctuates between 36 degrees and 47. The reason why it's doing that is because this pump that's providing half the oxygen is still next to some chill. This pump is now just pumping 47 or now 49 degree oxygen. And hypothetically, if all this oxygen was going to your duplicants and their small base, you're going to start killing crops. Because remember, a lot of your crops, just like your bristle blossom, aren't keen on temperatures above 30 degrees. But in this case, we've sort of proved how this system is self-powered, so we can get rid of the doors and just insulate everything in. Now, all the heat that you have in here is self-contained, which is both a blessing and a curse. First, we have to make sure our hydrogen generators don't overheat, and we can do that by taking all the hydrogen and run them in radiant gas pipes. And while the hydrogen is coming out at 50 degrees, it's okay because, and here's a key point of SPOMs, we built this hydrogen generator out of gold amalgam. And remember, gold amalgam gives a plus 50 degrees to your overheat temperature, making the final overheat temperature for the hydrogen generator 125 degrees. The same precaution goes into the gas pumps and the electrolyzers. These are all made out of gold amalgam. If you try to make a SPOM using, say, copper, and don't provide it an external source of cooling, you will start to damage buildings and your SPOM will fail. I also wanted to highlight our overflow system because, as you can see, our one hydrogen generator is eating the hydrogen as fast as possible, but we're still getting backed up. When that happens, the hydrogen's simply going to bypass the bridge, as we discussed before, and head over to this hydrogen generator, where in this case, we're just burning it off into a lamp. But there's nothing to say you can't take that power line and provide a little extra power to your colony and its power spine. One final detail about the oxygen being supplied in the system, because it's not really the 1776 grams per second. And there's one specific reason why. Remember when we spoke about the fact that a gas pump can only draw out 500 grams per second? Well, that's not really an issue when you have a backlog, because it's going to provide the 500 grams, and then it's going to backfill 500 more grams to give the gas pipe its maximum of 1,000 grams of gas. In this specific example, you don't have to do this, but the maximum throughput that one gas pipe's going to be able to give you is 1 kilo per second worth of oxygen, which means it's only providing enough oxygen for 10 duplicants. You might think, well, Echo, just separate the gas pumps from each other. For instance, maybe something like this. Now each gas pipe has their own independent line, but remember, then we're going to be beholden to the gas pump's maximum flow rate of 500 grams per second. In this case, the electrolyzers are able to produce more oxygen than the two gas pumps can handle. And that's the reason why the third number I want you to remember and ingrain in your head is gas pumps can only draw out 500 grams per second. So just to recap, we have three numbers to remember now. 1 kilo per second of water for the electrolyzer, 8.88 dupes per electrolyzer, and 500 grams per second per gas pump, or 5 dupes worth of oxygen per gas pump. So while the oxygen throughput on this system only allows you to support 10 duplicants, there's still some advantages to it. First, we're only using 2-strand wire, not conductive wire. There's no transformer in here. In fact, the only place where you actually need refined materials is for the smart battery, the 3 Atmos sensors, and a little bit for your automation wires. Now, just to make sure everybody has the overlays so they know exactly how to build this, here's our power, here's our plumbing, here's our ventilation, and finally, here's our automation. And now it's time for the most famous of SPOMs, the full Rodriguez. Well, maybe not the full Rodriguez. Let's just go ahead and say a half Rodriguez. Now, the story goes, somebody on the Clay forums invented a system that looked similar to this, and their last name was Rodriguez. Or at least that's what people remember. And thus, all the systems that sort of look like this have now historically taken on the moniker of Rodriguez. In this case, this is the half variant. Please excuse the debris inside of our system. I know it's unacceptable, but it's there. Let's just move on. The reason why I wanted to highlight this system is because of everything we just learned about flows. Notice now that we actually have 2 oxygen gas pumps per electrolyzer. In this case, we have some water coming in, attempting to cool the oxygen before it's fed to the electrolyzers. Because of the increased amount of gas pumps, we are running 2 hydrogen generators, and we once again have our hydrogen overflow. Are you starting to get the theme here? It's all very similar. But the reason why you need to remember the numbers so specifically is because this design, although very similar to our last design, provides a different amount of oxygen, even though there's only 2 electrolyzers. Because there's 4 gas pumps, each gas pump is able to move 500 grams per second. So we have a total throughput of 2,000 grams, or 2 kilos worth of oxygen per second, which you're thinking might be enough to support 20 duplicants. Remember, your electrolyzers can only produce 888 grams per second. It doesn't matter how much your gas pumps can consume. So in this case, we're getting that true 1776 grams worth of oxygen per second. In the last system, it was the gas pumps that were the limiting factor that decided how much oxygen you are producing for your dupes. In this system, it's your electrolyzers. Another difference with this system is the pressure. Because there's more room for oxygen, we can set these atmos sensors to what's become a pretty good standard. Above 450 for the oxygen and above 250 for the hydrogen. And now, just so everybody knows how to build it, here's our wonderful power, here's the plumbing, here's the ventilation, and here's the automation. And now it's time to highlight the very standard full Rodriguez. Now, there are 4 electrolyzers in a full Rodriguez, so you might think that it has a maximum throughput of 888 grams times 4, or 3,552 grams of oxygen per second. But this is another case where our limitation is actually in the gas pumps. We have 6 gas pumps, all able to consume 500 grams per second, which means our total throughput is 3,000 grams. In other words, the full Rodriguez can provide oxygen for 30 duplicants. Now, the core structure of this is the same. You'll notice that we didn't use tiles here in the middle. Instead, we used a manual airlock. Both systems work. We're still using the hydrogen and the radiant gas pipes to keep the hydrogen generators cold. In this case, we're actually using hydrogen generators made out of steel because we didn't have access to gold amalgam or gold. And with steel, we have an overheat temperature of 275. So they actually don't require a lot of cooling, but it's better to be safe than sorry. Now, with the full Rodriguez, because you're using 4 electrolyzers and 6 gas pumps, it's a pretty big power draw. For that reason, you actually use heavy watt wire connecting 4 hydrogen generators to 1 smart battery and 2 power transformers. And those 2 power transformers sort of separate the SPOM into 2 grids, one for the right side and one for the left side. Now, in this case, you'll notice there's no external cooling being provided to our oxygen. And this oxygen's coming out at 70 degrees. It's for this reason we actually have to provide cooling for the oxygen separately. In this case, we're using an anti-entropy thermal nullifier system and just running the gas pipes through the room and all the chill that the AETN provides. Getting these to equilibrium is normally even a little easier than the simple SPOM that we showed first. You're gonna need to kickstart some power, and I recommend disconnecting this pipe here and sending everything down to a gas reservoir to prevent damaging all of this equipment until you reach that beautiful equilibrium, and then you can just reconnect it. Not too shabby though, huh? We've managed to go from a simple system all the way to the classic full Rodriguez. Let's highlight some of those overlays. There's our power, there's our water, there's our ventilation, and here's our automation. Take note on the automation side that once again these atmos sensors are set at the classic 250, 450. Now, due to the fact that this is called the Ultimate SPOM tutorial, or the Ultimate SPOM guide, I haven't figured out which one I'm going to use yet. It wouldn't be complete unless we did a full build of a SPOM, as I'm sure there's going to be little tips and tricks that I'm going to be able to show you along the way. Now, I always start from the bottom and work up. And there's one specific reason on this, because your gas pumps are going to control the width of your SPOM. As a reminder, we try to use gold amalgam wherever we can. Now, please excuse the sandbox mode. Let's be honest. You get the idea. And now in this case, our SPOM is going to be a full Rodriguez, so we're going to start with 6 gas pumps. And despite what I told you before, we're going to start with a manual airlock on each level. That way, the duplicants can get in there and work and do any troubleshooting that may come up. Now, above your first 2 gas pumps, a lot of people are going to put 4 airflow tiles. And that's because, remember, you need the oxygen to be able to come through the tiles, so a lot of people use airflow tiles. And there's nothing wrong with this. But I prefer to use mesh tiles instead. And the reason why is because if your electrolyzers end up leaking, it's really difficult to see it on airflow tiles. For instance, there's a blob of polluted water sitting on these airflow tiles, and it was a little difficult to see. Even more difficult to see is a blob of water, like in this case here. And the reason why that's bad is there's a potential for these liquids to interfere with the correct operation of your electrolyzers. Now, if you do some clever searching around the internet, you're going to find people that purposely put liquids around their electrolyzers in an attempt to make sure that they don't ever hit max pressure. But I find these methods a little exploitive in nature, so I tend not to do them. But as always, you do you. Now here, we could put 2 tiles, but it's almost a better cost savings to just put 2 doors, depending on how you're doing on the quantities of raw minerals or metal ores. But either way will work. So now we have our 4 electrolyzers and our 6 gas pumps in. The duplicants can easily get from this ladder and be able to build all the way across and do what they need to do. The next step is to put in our hydrogen gas pump, again sticking to gold amalgam, and we also want to put our Atmos sensors in as well. Connect the pumps with the automation wires, and there we go. Now of note, you'll see some designs that actually connect all 6 of the gas pumps to these automation sensors. It's personal preference on which way you want to do it, as I haven't seen a big effect one way or the other. Now with that being said, I tend to do it separately, and the reason why I prefer to separate it, I allow these pumps to pull differently. So if the Atmos sensor says we've got enough pressure over here, it'll go ahead and pull. That way we don't get too much pressure on one side versus the other, which in theory helps the hydrogen stay stable. Next up is our insulated tiles that sets the floor for our next power level. The easiest way to remember this is you want a 1 tile gap between the door or the tiles, depending on what you choose, and the bottom here. From there, you're just going to put an entire run right across the top. Now's the time we put in the power. We're going to use a smart battery made of gold, 2 large power transformers, also made of gold, and then we're going to put down our first hydrogen generator, made out of gold amalgam. We're going to raise the back wall and then put in a heavy watt joint plate. There's not a big difference of whether or not you put it here or if you put it over here, but best practice is to have at least 1 heavy watt joint plate. Then we can put in our next floor and add 3 more hydrogen generators. After that, it's ready to kind of seal up. And then we have our SPOM pretty much framed up. Now, because I already did this automation here, I'm going to do the automation first here. I normally wait to do all the automation all at once, and that way you don't end up forgetting any. The automation is going to go from the smart battery and connect to each hydrogen generator. Now it's time for power. We're going to start at our smart battery, go across our power transformers, hit our first hydrogen generator, and then continue on, utilizing the heavy watt joint plate we put in, and then connect the rest of the hydrogen generators. And we're going to grab our conductive wire. Now the materials on the heavy watt wire and the conductive wires does not really matter. It's never going to get hot enough in here to melt, for instance, lead. So use whatever material you have the most of. And with that, power is pretty much done too. Now let's start with one of the more complicated processes of the SPOM, and that's the gas pipes. Now remember, in this standard example, we're not assuming any sort of cooling potential. But remember, when we start hooking all these up, this oxygen's gonna come out hot. And while outside the scope of this specific tutorial, you're gonna need to cool the oxygen somehow. Now to start off with, you can just put gas vents right on the outside of your SPOM. Because while this is waiting to hit equilibrium, there's gonna be a lot of junk and everything else coming out of here. Especially considering you might be building these in a biome that has chlorine or anything else, and you might not necessarily want all of the stuff in here being delivered directly to your colony, pretending like we're going through our own cooling system and it's heading down into the colony full of dupes. Now there's a lot of ways to do this, but remember, you're gonna have to deal with the excess hydrogen, just like in the examples we showed before. This is a popular location for the overflow. We have the bridge here, and we can overflow it this way. And this is important because a standard full Rodriguez will have a lot of excess hydrogen. In this case, we're just going to burn it in another hydrogen generator that's lighting up this lamp. But another great place for this is in your power brick. From there, we're going to grab our radiant gas pipes. Now remember, radiant gas pipes are typically made out of ores, and ores aren't great conductors. But to be honest, if you made everything out of gold amalgam, you're not going to need a great conductor, because the chances of these getting above 125 degrees with even minimal cooling is very low. So at this point, we're just going to wrap the radiant gas pipes all around the top part of the SPOM. I like to go above the hydrogen generators just a little bit to provide some extra cooling, and then hook the gas pipes around to feed the last 3 hydrogen generators. Now for our settings, we're going to make sure our smart battery's at 90-60, although you can get away with a 90-40 or a 90-80. It won't be a big deal once it gets going anyways, because it is self-powered. Let's also grab our Atmos sensors. We're going to set the hydrogen one to above 250 grams, and then set our oxygen ones to above 450 grams. Now, one curious design decision that we didn't do in this SPOM that we probably should have, assuming no cooling is coming in, is insulate the water pipes going in. And the reason why, this water is coming in at 26 degrees. Well, when this SPOM gets really warm, it's going to end up heating up the water being fed into the electrolyzers. Well, when you highlight over the outputs on the electrolyzer itself, you can see that the oxygen will be at least 70 degrees or hotter if the input materials are hotter. So you might save yourself a little bit of cooling by making all of these pipes insulated. The last thing we really need to do is provide power to get it going. Now, there's a couple of methods that you can use. One, you can just hook up some of your electrolyzers and pumps, for instance, this line right here, and start to get everything stabilized until you're producing enough hydrogen to where the self-powered nature can take over. Or you can hook right into the power brick. In this case, since I have a nearby conductive wire, I'm just going to hook in like so. Keep in mind, if you are just going to power one side, it needs to be the side with the hydrogen gas pump connected. Now I'm going to pause it because once this is powered on, the electrolyzers are going to start producing oxygen and hydrogen, and we're not quite ready. Remember I told you in this system here that if we started feeding the contents of this pipe directly to the hydrogen generators, we're going to end up with a bunch of broken hydrogen generators. And that may be a great throw caution to the wind solution. It's not the best way to do it. So what we're actually going to do is get rid of this hydrogen generator here, put in a wonderful gas buffer tank, connect it up, and then disconnect the line from going to the hydrogen generators to begin with. Now all the gas is going to be dumped into this gas reservoir. And once we unpause, everything will start working. The electrolyzers will start producing oxygen and hydrogen, although it may take a minute depending on the overall pressure here. The environment may already be maximum gas pressure, in which case it's going to take the gas pumps just a few minutes to be able to empty out everything else in here. A word of caution, if you do just power this bottom side, it's going to take you longer to be able to hit equilibrium. For the simple reason, you're going to have a bunch of oxygen over here. So until this gas pump up top ends up vacuuming up all this nonsense and the hydrogen spreads across, you won't have equilibrium. So the best case scenario, even if you only have a conductive wire, just tie it right into the battery. Now, it's not going to take long for you to pull too much power off this conductive wire, but this method is a lot quicker when it comes to reaching equilibrium. Oh, this is perfect. We have to take a break because we have an issue. Our overflow gas reservoir is full, so we would have to come destroy it and replace it or just add another one. Another issue that you might come up with is you'll notice that all of these pipes have hit maximum pressure. If your pumps can't draw out enough of your oxygen, the oxygen's gonna keep climbing up higher and higher, in which case you won't hit equilibrium either. So during this time, you need to make sure that you're not hitting max pressure. One method would be put it where you actually need the oxygen, or just use high pressure gas vents, and now you can see the equilibrium start to take effect. And bingo. At this point, this line is going to be nothing but hydrogen. And as long as we don't mess anything up, it always will be. Once the hydrogen starts flowing, give it a minute to allow it to snake all the way through so you have an ample enough amount of hydrogen, and then you can go ahead and disconnect from whatever power source you were using to get the whole thing going. Because at this point, it's 100% self-powered. We also need to make sure that we put in a more permanent overflow system because the gas reservoir would work until it got full. Then once everything's finished, don't forget to take away your high pressure gas vents and put your normal vents back in. Once you feel confident that the system's working as intended, you can go around and get rid of these manual airlocks and fully seal in your SPOM. Because remember, that heat's going to generate very, very quickly. Before we go look at the bad mamma jamma you saw on the thumbnail, I wanted to highlight this system here to show you that the fundamentals of a SPOM are all the same. Even though this has a completely different shape, it works identical to the previous examples. Its equilibrium is now dependent on this one door separating the electrolyzer and the hydrogen gas pump. So the hydrogen rises and the oxygen is pushed down to 2 oxygen gas pumps. Now in this example, because the hydrogen generator is producing more power than we really need, I connected it to our main power grid. But don't be fooled, it is 100% a SPOM. The automation is the same. We have one Atmos sensor controlling 2 gas pumps, and then we have one Atmos sensor controlling the hydrogen gas pump. The Atmos sensors are set on 150 and 450. Now looking at this, I'm going to ask you, the viewer, to tell me how many duplicants can this system support. And I'll give you a quick second to think about it. Remember, there's 2 gas pumps for oxygen and 1 electrolyzer. In this case, the 2 gas pumps could provide enough throughput to support 10 duplicants. 5 for each gas pump. Unfortunately, there's only one electrolyzer, which means we can only support 8.88 duplicants. Nice job. I know you got it right. Alright, let's go look at the monstrous SPOM. Before we can begin, take a look at all those beautiful buffer tanks. Now, if you think the system looks similar, you'd be absolutely right. It's just a full Rodriguez expanded. We have the same exact ratio of electrolyzers to gas pumps, with 10 electrolyzers to 15 gas pumps. And because the ratios are the same, the equilibrium's the same, it's just the structure looks a little bit different. Now, in this case, because there's so much space for oxygen, we actually want it to pool a little bit more. And for this reason, the bottom Atmos sensors are set on 600 and the hydrogen sensors set on 250. The power in these systems are pretty much identical. We have a bunch of hydrogen generators, all being fed with an absolute mess of hydrogen, and 5 power transformers, providing power in somewhat of a messy way. Now in this one we have a couple of damaged electrolyzers. It had to do with some nuclear waste coming in the pipes, but if you kept nuclear waste out of your SPOM pipes, yours wouldn't get this sort of damage. But it looks pretty similar to all the rest. I suppose another difference is the fact that we're using 2 gas pumps, because we're providing a lot more hydrogen generators with hydrogen. Another difference, and it's something you can do with any of your SPOMs, is we're actually cooling all the oxygen through a cool plate. We have a steam turbine and a thermal aqua tuner keeping all these metal tiles down to about 10 degrees. And because of that, the oxygen's coming out at around 13 degrees. Not too shabby, considering the massive amount of heat that this system causes. All the beautiful buffer tanks that you see are just because I have an affinity towards buffer tanks, and I wanted to make sure that we were able to provide the massive 10 kilos per second that this system requires. All said and done, the 10 electrolyzers would be providing enough oxygen for 88 dupes. But because we only have 15 gas pumps, we're actually only providing enough oxygen for 75 dupes. And this colony actually has 2 of these systems set up. This was for my 150 dupe challenge. I made it to about 130 before the frames and my patience got the best of me. Well, I hope you learned a lot about self-powered oxygen machines and now have the confidence and the fundamentals to design and build your own self-powered oxygen machines that may or may not conform to what everybody thinks they should look like. So until next time, happy gaming, and I'll talk to you soon.